The night before the funeral, my daughter stepped into the hallway, blocking my way, and said, "Tomorrow, at Mom's service, you will not speak." It was not a request, it was a sentence. The words didn't just land, they cut, swift and deliberate, as if she had been sharpening them in her mind for days. I had heard cruel things in my life, from strangers, from rivals, from people who never cared if I breathed or not, but never from her. Not like this. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. The soft lamplight in the hallway made her face look older, colder, like a stranger wearing my daughter's skin. Her voice shook, but not with grief, with a kind of brittle control, like someone who believes that pain can be managed by managing people. And I realized in that instant, she wasn't trembling because she was weak. She was trembling because she was ready to fight me if I said one word of refusal. "I'm not asking you, Dad," she added, softer now, as if the quiet could somehow soften the cruelty. "Please, just let it be." She turned before I could answer, the hem of her black dress brushing the hallway wall as she walked away, leaving the air heavy with something worse than anger: erasure. I stood there long after she disappeared into her room, the taste of unsaid words in my mouth. My grief had already hollowed me out, but this took what was left and made it echo. I wanted to shout after her, to ask why. Why now, of all times? Why, when the woman we both loved lay in a coffin only hours away from being lowered into the earth, did she feel the need to silence me? I pressed my palm against the wall, steadying myself, the plaster cold under my hand. I thought about my wife, about the way she always stood between us when tempers flared, about how she could take my daughter's sharpest words and dull them before they reached me. But there would be no buffer tomorrow. And now I was being told that when the time came to honor her, to speak her name into the air one last time, my voice would be absent by order of my own child. I didn't go after her. Not because I agreed, not because I was afraid, but because I knew something she didn't. Grief changes shape when you try to contain it. And one day, her words tonight would haunt her more than they hurt me. That night, in the silence of my room, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if she had rehearsed it. The look, the tone, the timing. If she'd imagined how I would stand there, too stunned to answer. And though the house was still, I could almost hear my wife's voice somewhere in the dark, warning me of a storm that had just begun. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? If you can, subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. I didn't answer her. Not because I agreed and not because I didn't have words, but because the air between us was already too thick with years of unfinished sentences. Silence had always been our most dangerous weapon. It didn't shatter windows or slam doors, but it hollowed out the space between us until even love had to squeeze to fit through. We had been here before in smaller ways. Missed birthdays that turned into curt phone calls, invitations that arrived too late to be useful, her hesitations when introducing me to her friends, as if she was quietly editing my place in her story. None of it ever exploded, it just lingered, a low hum of discontent, waiting for the right moment to become undeniable. And now, in the dim hallway, the night before we buried the woman who had held us together, it had become undeniable. My wife had been the bridge between us, but not the kind of bridge built to last without care. She was the one who could turn my blunt honesty into something my daughter could hear without flinching, the one who could take my daughter's sharp words and soften them before they reached me. She had been translator, mediator, anchor, and now she was gone. Without her, the distance between us was not just visible, it was a chasm, and my daughter had chosen this night, of all nights, to push me further to the edge. In my room I sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on my knees, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp through the curtains. I tried to remember the last time my daughter had looked at me with unguarded warmth. I couldn't find it. Even in the early years there had been a certain distance. Perhaps the way I worked too much, or how I wasn't always gentle when disappointment came. I told myself she'd understand when she was older, that one day she'd see the sacrifices I had made for this family. But children don't always grow into gratitude. Sometimes they grow into quiet judges. The room felt colder without my wife's presence, as if even the air had abandoned me. I thought about tomorrow, about standing there among the flowers and framed photographs, hearing others speak her name, tell their versions of our life, and knowing mine was forbidden, not because I had nothing to say, but because my daughter had decided the story was hers to curate. It wasn't the first time I'd been silenced. Life has a way of choosing its own narrators, and they're not always the ones who live the story. But it was the first time the silencing came from someone whose first word had been spoken into my palm when she was a baby, her tiny hand clutching my finger as if it were a promise we'd both keep forever. Now the promise was broken. Not loudly, not with accusations or screaming, but with the kind of quiet cruelty that leaves no visible wound, only the slow, relentless ache of being erased. And as I sat there in the dark, I realized that tomorrow would not just be about burying my wife. It would be about watching my place in her memory lowered into the ground alongside her. At dawn, the house was so still that the sound of my own footsteps felt out of place, like an intrusion into a world that no longer wanted movement. I walked into the living room, and the pale morning light spilling through the thin curtains cast everything in a fragile glow, as if the room itself was afraid to be touched. Her belongings were neatly stacked in quiet, obedient rows, waiting for the hands that would decide where they belonged now that she was gone. There was no chaos, no mess to distract me. Every sweater was folded perfectly the way she used to fold them, sleeves tucked just so, edges aligned, the kind of care that spoke of a lifetime spent finding beauty in small order. The scarves she had worn in winter still held faint traces of her perfume, that warm, steady scent I'd always associated with safety. Even the framed photographs leaned against the wall in precise lines, their faces frozen mid-laugh or mid-sunlight, each one whispering, "Remember without mercy." I moved slowly, not because I feared breaking anything, but because I feared breaking myself. My hands hovered above the stacks without touching, as though contact might erase what little of her still lived in them. Every object carried weight far beyond its physical form. The cardigan she wore on our last anniversary, the mug with a crack near the handle from the morning she dropped it while rushing to call our daughter, the leather-bound journal she never let anyone read. These were not just things. They were proofs, evidence that she had lived here, that we had lived here together, that the empty air between these walls had once been filled with her voice. And then I saw it. On the mantel, resting beside a small vase of dried flowers, was an envelope, unopened. My wife's handwriting looped across the front, steady and deliberate, the way she always wrote when something mattered. I froze, my breath caught halfway. It was not addressed to anyone. No, to my husband, no, for the family. Just her familiar script, as if the words inside were meant to find the right person without being told who that was. I didn't reach for it immediately. I stood there, staring, knowing that whatever was inside had waited for this moment, and once opened, it could never be unread. There was an intimacy to it, a quiet defiance against time, as though she had left this piece of herself not in spite of knowing she was leaving, but because of it. The room seemed to hold its breath with me. Even the morning light paused in the dust-speckled air. I thought about how absence doesn't just feel like emptiness. It presses on you, heavier than presence ever did. Her absence was everywhere in the spaces between furniture, in the silence where her footsteps used to echo, in the very air I was breathing. And yet, here was something she had left behind, a message that had crossed the border between the living and the gone to wait for me. I didn't open it, not yet. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and I could almost feel her pulse in the ink. Whatever it said, it would carry her voice. And in a house where her voice had been taken from me, I wasn't ready to spend it all at once. I stepped back, letting the envelope stay where it was, knowing that its weight would follow me until I was ready, or until it decided for me. I don't remember sitting down to open it. One moment I was standing in the living room, staring at the envelope like it might burn me, and the next I was at the kitchen table with the paper torn open in my hands. My fingers shook, not from weakness, but from the knowledge that this was the last time I would ever read something she had written with me in mind. The note was small, the kind you could fold into your palm and hide, but its presence filled the room. Her handwriting looked the same as it always had, neat, steady, almost stubborn in its precision, but the words were unlike anything she'd left me before. "If they silence you, let me speak for us." That was all. No greeting, no sign-off, just that single sentence, and the date written neatly in the corner, months ago. Long before hospital visits became daily rituals, before the medications dulled her voice, before she left me with a bed that still felt warm on one side, even when it was cold, I stared at the words until they blurred. There was a sharpness in them, a quiet readiness that told me she had seen this coming. She had known that once she was gone, the fragile balance between me and our daughter would shatter. She had known there would be voices eager to control the story, to choose what was remembered and what was buried. And she had known that I, the one who had walked beside her through the decades, might not be invited to speak about it. It hit me then. This was not just a note, it was a warning, a shield she had forged in advance, knowing I might need it when she could no longer stand beside me. And the fact that she had dated it months before her death made it feel heavier, as if she had been living her final season with two battles, the one against her illness and the one against the silence she feared would follow. I placed the note flat on the table, tracing each word with the tip of my finger. Her voice was in those letters, not the soft, laughing voice she used when the house was full of light, but the low, steady voice she used when she meant business. The voice that had ended arguments, protected friends, and made our daughter listen, even when she didn't want to. I wondered if she had ever rehearsed it in her mind, imagining the day I might find it. I wondered if she knew it would feel like a hand reaching for mine across the impossible distance between the living and the gone. In the quiet, I could almost hear her breathing beside me, the way she used to lean forward when she wanted me to understand something without her having to say it twice. She wasn't asking me to fight, and she wasn't asking me to stay quiet. She was reminding me that even if my voice was stolen, hers could still speak, and that together, even in absence, we would be harder to erase. I folded the note carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. I didn't know yet how she intended to speak for us, but I knew this. When the moment came, I wouldn't let her words stay hidden. And for the first time since my daughter's command in the hallway, I felt something other than grief. I felt the faint, steady pulse of resolve. The church doors stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow the morning, and as I stepped inside, the world shifted into a different kind of silence. Not the empty quiet of home, but the muffled hush of people holding their breath in grief. The air was thick, heavy with perfume that clung to the velvet pews, the faint sting of fresh flowers crammed into every corner, and the unspoken weight of words people rehearsed on the way here, but might never say out loud. The space was already crowded. Family I had not seen in years sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces framed by black clothing and lowered gazes. Old neighbors, co-workers of hers I had only met once at office parties, friends from years gone by whose names I could not recall. All of them were here, staring at the casket like it was an answer to a question none of us had asked out loud. Some faces lit with recognition when they saw me. Others flickered with the awkward hesitation of people who weren't sure they should approach. And then there was my daughter. She moved through the room as if she had been born to host gatherings like this, shaking hands, leaning in to murmur sympathy, directing people to seats with a gentle touch on the arm. She carried herself with grace, but it was the kind of grace that had been ironed flat, controlled down to the last detail. Every movement seemed intentional, as if she believed that by managing every person, she could also manage the grief itself. She never once looked at me, not directly. Her eyes slid past mine the way one avoids a mirror they aren't ready to face. She spoke to people beside me, behind me, across the aisle from me, but not to me. It was a performance, and in some cruel way I almost admired how flawlessly she maintained it. I took a seat near the back. Not because I wanted distance, but because I didn't want to fight for space in a front row that was already claimed in her mind. From there, I could watch the room without being part of its machinery. Every so often, I caught whispers, fragments of memories about my wife, about how kind she was, how generous, how she had a way of making everyone feel like they belonged. And with each word, I felt a strange tug in my chest. It wasn't jealousy, but it was something close to it. The knowledge that these people could speak her name today, could share their piece of her, while I sat silent under my own daughter's decree. The casket stood at the front, a single spray of lilies draped across its lid. The sight of it was almost unbearable, not because it made her death real. That had happened the moment I woke up in an empty bed, but because it looked like the final punctuation to a story we hadn't finished writing. The wood gleamed under the light, polished to perfection, as if beauty could make the absence inside any less devastating. From my seat, I studied my daughter's profile as she bent to hug someone. She looked so much like her mother in that moment that it twisted something deep in me. The tilt of her head, the way her hands lingered on someone's shoulders as she listened, those were things my wife had done without thinking. And yet, where my wife had radiated warmth, my daughter's movements carried a quiet frost. I could not tell if it was meant to protect her or to protect the image she wanted to present. As the murmurs died down and the first speaker approached the podium, the room shifted again, from conversation to ceremony. I felt the note in my pocket, the envelope soft and warm from the heat of my hand. Her words pulsed there like a heartbeat, reminding me that my silence today was not an ending, only a pause. And while my daughter's eyes still did not meet mine, I knew that somewhere in this crowd the moment she feared was already on its way. My wife had seen it coming, and so had I. One by one, they went up, some with trembling hands clutching pieces of paper, others speaking freely, their voices carrying the kind of ease that comes from telling only the parts of the story that fit neatly into the room. They spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her laughter that could fill a space like sunlight. They spoke of the way she remembered birthdays, how she made soup for neighbors in winter, how she could make even the shyest person feel welcome at a crowded table. And while I listened, I smiled in the small, polite way that funerals demand. But inside, every word scraped against something raw, because I knew there was more. There was the truth that lived in the hours no one here had seen. The years when the laughter was thin because we didn't know if the bills would get paid. The nights she held my hand under the covers when I thought I couldn't take one more day of the weight on my shoulders. The mornings she went without breakfast so our daughter could have lunch money. The hard parts, the heavy parts, the parts that made the light possible. Those were ours, and ours alone. And here they were being buried in silence, as if they were less worthy of remembering. Every now and then I thought I saw an opening, a pause between speakers, a shifting of the program, and I wondered if this was it, my moment to stand, to walk to the front and take my place. But then another name would be called, another set of steps toward the microphone, another gentle applause, as the next carefully polished memory was offered to the room. From my seat in the back, I could see my daughter keeping time, like a conductor. A nod here, a whisper there, her eyes moving over the order of service, as if she had choreographed the entire morning. And when someone hesitated, she was quick to step in, quick to guide them toward the next thing, never leaving space for the unplanned, especially the unplanned that might have been me. The truth was, my chance never came. Not because I was overlooked by accident, but because there was no intention to give me one. And so I sat, my hands folded over my lap, the note in my pocket feeling heavier with each passing minute. I could feel my wife's words pressing against me. If they silence you, let me speak for us. I looked at the casket, at the lilies curling at their edges under the warm light. I imagined her inside, listening to all of this, the stories that painted her as though her life had been all summer and no winter. I thought of what she would say if she could open her eyes and sit up in that moment. She would thank them, yes, but then she would look for me. She would want the truth told, not to tarnish the beauty, but to make it whole. As the final speaker stepped down, the murmur of approval rose again, and I felt the walls close in. The program was moving forward without me, without my voice, without the years I carried inside me like a second spine. The service was not over, but the moment, my moment, had passed. And yet, in that passing, something hardened in me. I had not been given the space to speak, but that didn't mean the words would remain unspoken. My wife had left me the means to make sure of it. The silence they thought they had secured was only a pause in a story that was far from finished. As the last speaker's words faded and the polite ripple of applause passed through the pews, I felt the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the service coming to its quiet close. It was the knowledge that if I let this end without doing something, my wife's voice would vanish from this day entirely. The truth of our life together would be reduced to warm anecdotes and carefully framed smiles. A portrait painted in only one color. My hand slipped into my coat pocket almost without thought, and there it was. The small, smooth shape of the USB drive. It was warm from being against my body, and yet it felt like ice in my hand. I had carried it since the morning I found the letter, and even before that, it had been hers. I knew exactly what was on it. Months earlier, long before anyone outside our home knew how close we were to losing her, she had sat down and recorded something. Not a farewell, not just a message, a testimony. Her own account in her own words of who she was, what we had built, and what she wanted remembered. I could see her in my mind, sitting at the small desk in the corner of our bedroom, her hair pulled back, her face paler than she liked to admit, but her eyes steady. She'd told me she was writing letters, but clearly she had been doing more than that. I imagined her leaning toward the camera, speaking with the calm certainty that had always made people listen. She wouldn't have wasted time on pleasantries. She would have gone straight to the marrow, cutting through the noise to say what needed saying. She would have made it impossible to pretend she hadn't lived the whole truth, not just the parts that fit neatly into a eulogy. I looked toward the front of the church. The pastor was about to speak again, to offer the closing words before the procession. My daughter sat in the front row, her hands folded, her expression perfectly composed. She had orchestrated everything to this point, and I knew, that if I walked away today without acting, her version of the story would be the one that settled in the minds of everyone here. My wife had predicted this. She had given me the drive for this exact reason. I turned the small object over in my palm, feeling its edges, its weight. This was not rebellion for the sake of defiance. This was keeping a promise I had never been asked to make, but had been trusted to honor. If they silence you, let me speak for us. Those words from the letter burned brighter in my mind than the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. I felt the blood in my ears, the low rush of my own heartbeat. There would be no asking for permission, no polite request to add one more speaker. I wasn't here to be granted space. I was here to take it, not for myself, but for her. And in that moment, the decision was no longer heavy. It was simple. I would walk to the man running the slideshow. I would hand him the drive, and I would make sure that in this room, on this day, her voice would be heard whether my daughter wanted it or not. Because love does not end at the casket, and the truth does not wait for an invitation. I rose from my seat without a word, the wooden pew creaking beneath me in the quiet that followed the last speaker. No one turned to look right away. The congregation was still caught in the lull before the pastor's closing words. But a few heads shifted as I stepped into the aisle. My steps were steady, unhurried, as if I were simply moving to adjust a flower arrangement or greet someone in the front row. Inside, though, my pulse was steady for a different reason. I had already made my choice. The man running the slideshow sat at a small table near the side, half hidden by the choir stalls, his eyes on the laptop in front of him. The soft hum of the projector filled the air, the last image of my wife still frozen on the screen. Her smile captured from some long-ago family gathering. I could see the USB ports glinting under the fluorescent light. My hand slipped into my pocket, curling around the drive. I didn't rush. I didn't allow my movements to look like anything that could be stopped. When I reached him, I bent slightly, close enough so only he could hear me. I placed the drive in his open palm and closed his fingers around it. "She wanted this played," I said. My voice was low, but not soft, low like a door being locked, low like something final. There was no room for questions in my tone, no gap where refusal could wedge itself. He looked at me for a moment, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but the weight of my gaze made him turn back to the screen without a word. I could see the hesitation in his hands as he unplugged the current slideshow, inserting the drive with a small click that sounded far louder in my mind than in the room. As I stepped back, I caught a glimpse of my daughter in the front row. She had noticed me now, her head tilting slightly, the faintest shadow crossing her expression. Not anger yet, not understanding either, just that first ripple when still water realizes something has been dropped into it. She turned her attention forward again, perhaps thinking it was nothing, but I knew the moment she heard the first note of her mother's voice, she would understand exactly what was happening. The technician's fingers moved across the keyboard. The screen flickered to black for a second, the lilies on the casket catching the sudden dimness. Conversations in the back row stilled. The shift in the air was subtle, like the moment before a storm touches down. I returned to my seat, not in the back where I had been, but a few rows closer, where I could see the faces in the front more clearly. My daughter didn't turn. No one spoke to me, but I could feel the energy of the room shift, leaning unconsciously toward what was about to happen, like wheat bending toward an unseen wind. In my pocket, the empty space where the USB had been felt lighter, and yet my chest felt heavier than ever. I had set the wheels in motion. There was no taking it back now, and that was exactly how my wife would have wanted it. The lights dimmed slowly, the stained glass colors on the walls fading into muted shadows, until the church was bathed in a soft darkness. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of sound people make when they sense something is about to shift, but don't yet know how. And then, the screen at the front came alive, not with a slideshow of still photographs or the gentle fade of floral borders, but with movement. There she was. Not the fragile figure I had watched in the hospital bed during those final weeks, skin pale, voice barely more than a whisper. Not the woman diminished by tubes, monitors, and the constant weight of her own failing body. No, this was her as she truly was, the way she wanted to be remembered. Her hair was brushed back from her face, the way she always wore it when she had something important to say. Her posture was straight, her shoulders squared, but not stiff. She was sitting in her favorite chair in the living room, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains behind her, giving her that soft halo I'd seen 1,000 times in the mornings we spent together. Her eyes were bright, sharp, but kind, the kind of eyes that didn't just look at you but into you. And when her lips curved into that small, deliberate smile, the one that meant she was about to say something worth listening to, the entire room leaned forward without realizing it. For a heartbeat, I forgot where I was. It felt like she had simply stepped into the church, unannounced, and taken her place at the front. And in a way, she had. The faint timbre of her voice filled the space, warm and steady, the kind of sound that could quiet an argument without raising in volume. I heard gasps in the pews, the surprised intake of breath from people who clearly hadn't expected this. Even the pastor paused, his hands folding in front of him as if he understood that the service had just been handed over to someone else entirely. My daughter, in the front row, went rigid. I could see the way her back stiffened, the way her chin lifted almost involuntarily, as if bracing herself for impact. The camera's angle was simple, unadorned, just her and the space around her, no distractions, and that was enough. Her presence alone commanded the room. She wasn't just appearing on a screen. She was reclaiming her place among us, taking back the voice she had been denied in life's final days. I watched her eyes move, as if she were scanning the room even now, seeing each of us where we sat. I knew those eyes well enough to imagine exactly what they were saying without words. Listen, this matters. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of lilies and the faint rustle of clothing as people settled deeper into their seats, I felt something break open inside me. Not in grief this time, but in the deep, undeniable recognition that she was still here in the ways that mattered most. She was alive in the truth she carried, and that truth was about to be spoken into a room that could no longer pretend it didn't need to hear it. Her voice flowed into the dimmed space like a river cutting through years of dust. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't rehearsed in that stiff, careful way people prepare speeches for public moments. No, it was the kind of speaking she had always done best, intimate, deliberate, certain. She began with the beginning, our beginning, painting it not as a fairy tale, but as the raw, unpolished truth. She spoke of the one-bedroom apartment where the ceiling leaked when it rained, where we learned how to patch drywall together because hiring someone was out of the question. She told of the winters when we kept only one room heated to save money, huddling together under layers of blankets with coffee cups warming our hands. She didn't skip the hard years. In fact, she lingered on them, not to elicit pity, but to show the foundation beneath everything else. She spoke of the time I worked 2 jobs and came home smelling of metal and oil, too tired to eat but unwilling to let her fall asleep without me beside her. She told them about the months we sold anything we could spare to cover medical bills when our daughter was small, how there had been nights when she'd cried silently into my shirt so our child wouldn't hear. Then she spoke of the victories, not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that change a family. Paying off the mortgage early, watching our daughter graduate and knowing every penny of that gown had been fought for, buying her mother's old piano so it would stay in the family even though we had to live without a car for months to afford it. She spoke of these moments as if they were pearls strung together, each one earned, not given. And then, without warning, her voice shifted, softer, yet edged with the kind of steel only love can forge. I saw her eyes on the screen change direction, as if she were looking past the camera to a specific place in the room, to the front row, to our daughter. "Don't let grief make you smaller," she said. The words didn't break, they didn't waver. "Don't erase the hands that held you." The air in the church tightened. You could feel it, the way people stopped even the small movements, the way every ear leaned in without moving closer. She wasn't angry, and she wasn't pleading. She was delivering a truth that could not be softened. I watched my daughter's shoulders tense, her chin lowering slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. She didn't look back at me, but I could feel the heat of her awareness, the way those words had found her, wrapped around her, and refused to let go. And I sat there with my heart in my throat, torn between pride and a grief so deep it felt like it had its own heartbeat. Pride because my wife had done what I could not. She had spoken into the silence, cutting through it with precision and grace. Grief, because it took her absence to make that voice ring loud enough for our daughter to hear. Her words lingered in the air long after she paused. Even the lilies on the casket seemed to bow slightly under their weight. And in that stillness I realized she had not just been speaking to our daughter. She had been speaking to the whole room, to anyone who had ever thought that love could be erased by control, or that truth could be edited into something smaller than it was. Her voice didn't falter, not once. She began to weave in the kind of truths that live in the shadows, the ones you don't parade at family dinners or write on Christmas cards, but the ones that form the spine of a life together. She spoke about the things I had never told anyone, not even her in their fullest detail, and yet she had known them all the same. She told them how, in our daughter's first year of college, when tuition and rent collided like 2 storms over our heads, I took on night shifts no one else wanted. Jobs in the cold, in the noise, in the places where you measure time by the hum of machinery and the ache in your hands. She described how I'd come home just as the sun was rising, careful not to wake them, the smell of metal clinging to my clothes, my shoulders stiff from hours of lifting and bending. She said it without drama, without embellishment, just the plain truth, which somehow made it heavier. Then she spoke of the day we almost lost the house. It was a month when every bill seemed to arrive early and the money came late. I had sold my watch, the only luxury I had ever bought for myself, a gift I'd saved for over years. She told them how I had taken it to the pawn shop without a word, sliding it across the counter like it meant nothing, when in truth it had been the only thing I'd ever owned that felt like it belonged solely to me. She explained how that single act had covered just enough to keep the mortgage from slipping past due, and she was careful. Careful not to paint these moments as grand sacrifices, careful not to make it sound like I had done them for praise. She said simply, "He didn't do it for gratitude. He did it so you could sleep without fear in your own home, so you could open the door and know it was still yours." The church was utterly still. No coughs, no shifting in seats, just the soft hum of the projector and her voice pouring truth into a room that had been full of half-stories until now. People who had known me for decades were hearing parts of my life as if for the first time. I saw expressions change, brows draw together, eyes narrow in a way that said they were piecing together a puzzle they hadn't even realized was missing pieces. My daughter sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But I could see in the stillness of her jaw that she was absorbing every word, that the neat version of events she had built in her mind was being dismantled brick by brick. I didn't move. I didn't want to steal a second of her voice with the sound of my own. My wife had taken the years I had carried in silence and laid them bare without apology, not to shame anyone, not to ask for anything, but because, as she had always believed, you cannot truly understand a person's worth unless you've seen the weight they've carried and the miles they've walked unseen. And in that moment, it struck me. She wasn't just telling our daughter the full story. She was making sure that when she was gone, the truth would be too deeply rooted to ever be pulled out. The silence that followed her words was not the comfortable kind that comes when a room agrees. It was the heavy, breathless kind that settles when something undeniable has been placed in the center and no one knows how to move around it. It felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened, making every inhale deliberate, every movement a disturbance. My daughter sat perfectly still in the front row, her back straight, but no longer with the practiced composure she had worn all morning. Her eyes glistened, not with the tidy tears of someone who knows when to cry for effect, but with the raw wetness of a truth breaking through walls she had built. Her hands were locked together in her lap, fingers woven so tightly that the tips had gone white, like she was holding on to something only she could see. Around her, the rest of the family shifted in their seats, but not toward me. If anything, they seemed to lean away, not out of disdain, but out of an awkward awareness, as though my wife's voice had just redrawn the map of this room, and no one was sure where they belonged on it. Eyes darted, glances brushed over me and then quickly away, as if meeting my gaze would be an acknowledgement of something they weren't ready to face. Even those who had spoken earlier, the ones who had painted my wife's life in soft pastels, now looked different, as if her words had added shadows to their portraits, depth they hadn't expected. A cousin near the aisle stared down at her folded program like it might offer instructions for how to sit through what was happening. An old neighbor twisted the edge of his sleeve between his fingers, his lips pressed together in a way that told me he was replaying things he'd once assumed about us. It was as if the video had rearranged the seating in the room without moving a single chair. The front row no longer belonged entirely to my daughter. The space at the back where I had sat earlier no longer felt like exile. The invisible lines between who was allowed to speak and who was meant to stay silent had been crossed. Not loudly, not with force, but with the calm certainty my wife had always carried. The pastor stood off to the side, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable, but there was a stillness in him too, like even he knew there was nothing to add. And me? I sat watching it unfold, not in triumph, but in a quiet, almost aching relief. This was not revenge. This was not winning. This was balance being restored in a way no one could undo. I had spent the morning carrying the weight of being erased, and now that weight had shifted, not entirely lifted, but shared. The truth was no longer just mine to hold. It was in the air now, in the ears and minds of every person in this church. My wife had taken the story back. She had placed it where it belonged. And in doing so, she had given me something no one else here had thought to offer. Not the permission to speak, but the certainty that I had already been heard. Her voice, steady until now, softened, as if she knew the end was near. not just of the recording, but of the bridge she was building with these words. She leaned slightly closer to the camera, her face filling the screen in a way that felt almost like she was leaning over the edge of time itself to reach us. The corners of her mouth curved into that faint, knowing smile I had seen 1,000 times in our years together. The one that always came when she was about to say something she wanted remembered. "If you're hearing this," she began, pausing just enough to make every person in the room still themselves, "I'm gone." The syllables fell with a weight that silenced even the quietest shuffling in the pews. There was no melodrama in her tone, no trembling, just the bare truth, delivered with the calm of someone who had already made peace with it. She let the words settle, gave them space to land. Her eyes didn't look sad, they looked certain. And then, without breaking that gaze, she added, "But if you're hearing this, then he's here." She didn't say my name, but the effect was as sharp as if she had. Heads in the room turned slightly, as though they couldn't help but glance in my direction. I didn't move, I couldn't. Her smile grew a fraction deeper, a softness behind it that belonged to moments only we had shared. "And if he's here," she continued, each word deliberate, "listen to him." It wasn't a plea, it wasn't even a request. It was an instruction, layered with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be obeyed. There was no room for argument, not in her tone, not in the way her eyes seemed to hold the entire room still. And then, as though she had given everything she needed to give, she simply let the moment close. No long farewell, no poetic last line to dress the truth in flowers. Just the screen fading into black, the sudden absence of her voice making the silence roar. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The darkened screen reflected the faint light from the windows, but it was empty now, a hollow rectangle where she had just been alive again. I could feel the collective ache of the room, the reluctant acceptance that the moment was over. My daughter's head was bowed now, her hands unmoving in her lap. I couldn't see her face, but her stillness told me enough. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably, the air thick with the awareness that they had just witnessed something far more intimate than they had expected when they walked into this church. As for me, I stayed where I was, letting the black screen linger in my vision. It felt like the echo of her presence was still in the room, hovering just above us, daring anyone to speak next and risk breaking what she had just built. She had taken her final breath long ago, but in that moment, in that voice, that look, that final command, she had found a way to stand beside me again, and I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than grief, that even in the silence that followed, she had not truly left. When the screen went black, it was as if the whole church was holding its breath, unsure what to do with the weight my wife had just laid across every lap and heart in the room. The pastor didn't speak, the family didn't shuffle to their feet, and even the flowers seemed to stand still, their scent dense in the air like a curtain no one dared move through. My daughter sat frozen in the front row, her shoulders slightly bowed now, as if something had been lifted off her and yet replaced with something just as heavy. Only this time it wasn't made of defiance. She didn't turn quickly. It was slow, almost reluctant, like she knew the second our eyes met she couldn't unsee what she would find there. But when she did look at me, the world between us shifted. For months, maybe years, there had been this invisible wall, not built in one blow, but brick by brick. Missed calls, shortened conversations, judgments left unspoken but felt all the same. That wall had always stood firm, cold, unyielding, but now I could see the first crack. Her gaze was wet, but it wasn't the frantic wetness of public crying. It was deeper, the kind of damp that comes when you've just realized something that can't be taken back. She looked at me not like an enemy, not even like a father she was unsure of, but like someone holding a fragile piece of truth they weren't sure how to carry. She didn't run to me. I didn't expect her to. We were too far from that place, and rushing it would have been like trying to stitch a wound before the bleeding had even slowed. But in her eyes I saw something heavier than sorrow, understanding. And understanding, I knew, was the seed from which forgiveness might someday grow. if we gave it time and didn't trample it under old arguments. We stayed like that for only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Her lips parted slightly as if she might speak, but no sound came. She didn't need to say it. The unspoken apology was there in the way her shoulders softened, in the way she no longer avoided my gaze like it was something dangerous. She was looking at me the way people look when they realize they've only been hearing half a story, and the other half is not what they expected. I didn't smile and I didn't nod. Any acknowledgement would have broken the delicate thread strung between us in that moment. Instead, I just let it be. Two people who had been circling each other in silence for too long, finally standing still long enough to see the other clearly. Somewhere deep inside me, the sharp ache I'd been carrying all morning loosened just a little, replaced by something quieter, not peace, not yet, but possibility, and for the first time in years that felt like enough. Weeks later, the church service had faded into the kind of memory that doesn't play like a film, but lingers like the smell of rain after a storm, impossible to capture, impossible to forget. Life around me had returned to its usual rhythms, or at least the rhythms people pretend to return to after loss. But inside, something had shifted in a way I couldn't name. The video sat on my desk, the USB drive placed in the small wooden tray where I kept things I couldn't risk misplacing. My father's pocket knife, an old photograph of us on our wedding day, a letter my daughter wrote in 3rd grade. It sat there quietly, without ceremony, as if it were just another object, but it wasn't. It was her voice, her face, her truth, frozen in that small piece of plastic and metal. The temptation to play it again was there at first, sharp and insistent, but I resisted, not because I feared hearing it, but because I didn't need to. I had already heard her voice in the only place it truly mattered, in that church, in that moment when the weight of silence was meant to bury me alongside her, and instead she rose into the room like sunlight breaking through a locked door. Her words hadn't just filled the air. They had carved themselves into the walls, into the floor, into the spaces between each heartbeat. That kind of hearing doesn't fade. It stays. Some days I would walk past the desk and glance at the drive, feeling the way its presence steadied me. I didn't need to replay it to remember her exact tone when she told them to listen to me, the certainty in her eyes when she told our daughter not to erase the hands that held her. Those lines lived in me now, carried in my chest like a second pulse. And slowly, I began to notice something. In small, almost invisible ways, my daughter's voice toward me began to change. It wasn't dramatic, no tearful confessions or grand reconciliations. But the clipped edge in her tone softened. She called more often, not with heavy conversation, but with the light, practical things that weave a relationship back together, thread by thread. And every time she did, I knew that some part of her was still hearing her mother's words, even if she'd never admitted out loud. I understood then that what my wife had left me was more than a defense against being silenced. It was proof. Proof that even when she could no longer stand beside me, she would not allow me to be erased. Proof that truth, once spoken in the right moment, has a way of echoing long after the room has emptied. So I left the drive where it was, untouched, but never forgotten. I didn't need to see her face flicker on the screen again, to feel her presence. She had already given me what I needed. The assurance that my voice had been heard, that my place in our story was secure, that even in the spaces where others might try to write me out, the ink would never fully take. Even without her here, I was no longer invisible, no longer unheard, because her voice had stayed, and in staying, it had given mine the strength to remain.